The Millionaire's triplets never smiled again until the new maid arrived and did the impossible. The house had never been this quiet. No footsteps, no laughter, not even the faint sound of toys bumping on the floor. Just a heavy stillness thick enough to feel, as if the air itself was waiting for something to break. David Collins stood in the doorway, keys still clenched in his hand, eyes drifting across the sunlit living room. He was a renowned architect in Seattle, a man who designed skyscrapers that touched the clouds, yet somehow couldn't build a home that held warmth. His wife, Laura, had been gone for 4 years, leaving behind 3 young boys and a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home. This afternoon, his meeting had ended earlier than usual. For reasons he couldn't name, he decided to come home. But the moment he opened the door, he knew something was off. No laughter, no cartoons, no bickering over snacks. Only silence, deep and foreign. He set down his briefcase and called out, "Ethan, Luke, Lucas?" No answer. His heart picked up speed. A chill slid down his spine. He crossed the living room, everything spotless, too clean. The dining table was perfectly set, the TV dark, the chairs aligned like soldiers, not a trace of childhood anywhere. "Clara?" He tried again, voice low, rough. Nothing, just the faint sigh of wind slipping through the window. David reached the last door at the end of the hall, the boys' room. A sliver of light cut through the crack. He pushed it open and froze. His 3 sons, Ethan, Luke, and Lucas, were kneeling on the wooden floor, hands folded, heads bowed. Beside them sat Clara, the new housekeeper, the quiet young woman who had only been with them for a few weeks. Her voice rose softly through the dim light, calm and melodic. "Thank you, God, for helping us not be angry today. Thank you for the love that's still here." Sunlight spilled through the window, painting the boys' hair in gold. They didn't fidget, didn't speak. The peace in that room felt almost sacred, a kind of stillness David hadn't felt since Laura died. He didn't step inside. He stood in the doorway, hand resting against the frame, throat tightening. His eyes burned. 4 years. He hadn't cried once, not at the funeral, not during late nights alone, not even when his children called for their mother in their sleep. He'd forgotten how to feel. But now, watching his boys kneel beside this quiet stranger, something cracked open inside his chest. Clara looked up. Their eyes met. She didn't speak, just nodded gently, as if to say, "Let it be." David drew a slow breath, his voice barely a whisper. "Laura, if you could see this, you'd smile." The house, once a tomb of silence, exhaled. A fragile warmth began to return, not loud, not bright, just real. And standing there in that golden quiet, David Collins realized the truth he had buried for years. What he had lost wasn't just his family, it was himself. When the door closed, the sound of his children's prayer faded down the hall, leaving a silence so deep it felt alive. David walked back to his office, each step heavy, as if memory itself weighed him down. The room was exactly as he had left it, polished desk, warm lamplight, a half-finished model sitting in the center. He sat, but peace didn't come. The image of his boys kneeling in the golden light lingered behind his eyes, tugging at something inside him that had long been numb. 4 years had passed since Laura was gone, but time had done nothing to dull the ache. Every rainfall still carried that night back to him, the storm, the headlights, the phone call that froze him in place. They said accidents happened in an instant, but for David, that instant never ended. The next morning, her yellow raincoat was still draped over the chair, her coffee cup still warm, her last text glowing on the screen. "Don't stay up too late." He never got to reply. After the funeral, he stopped crying. He simply worked. He built towers that touched the skyline, but when the city lights went dark, he found himself standing in a hollow space he couldn't design his way out of. He drew perfect lines, believing precision could cure pain, but grief doesn't live on paper. It lives in heartbeat stumbles, sleepless nights, and the sound of a child whispering, "Mommy," into the dark. Ethan, the oldest, learned to hide pain behind anger. He slammed doors, broke toys, yelled at nannies, and sometimes at his father. Luke, the quiet one, disappeared into himself, watching rain fall for hours without a word. Lucas, the youngest, asked every night, "Why didn't God save Mommy?" A small question that could break a grown man. David never answered. He would just rest his hand on his son's hair and say, "Sleep," before leaving the room, pretending not to hear the quiet sobs that followed. Nannies came and went like ghosts. They began with sympathy, ended with exhaustion. A week, 2, and they were gone. Ethan called them the ghosts because no one stayed long enough to be remembered. His mother, Margaret, tried to fill the void with order. "Structure keeps things together," she said. And so the house became a schedule: dinner at 6, study at 8, lights out at 9, everything precise, everything cold, because love doesn't run on time. David didn't fight it, he let her. He thought tidiness was love, that control was care. But at midnight, when the clock ticked through another empty hour, he could still hear what wasn't there. Laura's laugh, the echo of Mom from a child's dream. One evening, he heard Ethan scream from his room, "You're never here. You only care about work." The door slammed and the sound sliced through him. He didn't move. He sat at his desk, staring at a meaningless drawing, his hands trembling. Sometimes he opened his laptop not to work, but to look at a photo. Laura on the beach, hair wild in the wind, holding their boys close. He was behind the camera, smiling, a smile so pure he could no longer remember how it felt. When Laura died, the house died with her. The walls remained, perfect and pale, filled with expensive silence. And somewhere in that emptiness, David Collins realized the cruelest truth of all. He had spent a lifetime building homes for others, yet never learned how to keep his own. The days that followed were much the same: quiet, tidy, and tired. David still left before dawn and returned long after dark, hiding behind blueprints and deadlines as if work could fill the void that grief had carved in him. Then, one Monday morning, a soft knock echoed through the cold penthouse, the kind of sound that carries change with it. The woman standing at the door was small, gentle-looking, with brown hair pulled neatly back. Her smile was cautious, but kind. "I'm Clara Thompson," she said softly. "The agency sent me. They said you needed help around the house." Her voice carried a hint of Louisiana warmth, the kind that lingered after each word. David glanced up from his laptop, expression unreadable. "Fine," he said flatly. "Do your job. If it works out, you can stay." Clara nodded, murmuring, "Yes, sir, I'll do my best." She was 27, once a pediatric nurse back in Louisiana. But after a loss of her own, she had left that world behind, trading sterile hospital halls for silence and soap water. No one in that house knew what she had been through, and she never volunteered to tell. The boys didn't make it easy. Ethan watched her from the staircase, wary. Luke didn't even look up from his book. Lucas, the youngest, asked bluntly, "Are you going to leave like all the others?" Clara froze for a moment, then smiled faintly. "No, sweetheart, I don't plan to." The first day was chaos. She spilled the mop bucket, Lucas threw a ball that shattered a vase, and Ethan deliberately kicked over the potted plant she just placed by the window. By evening, Clara sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling around a cup of tea, eyes glistening with exhaustion. Upstairs, the boys laughed, proud of their small rebellion. Margaret watched her with a skeptical glance. "You don't have to try so hard, dear. No one lasts here." But Clara only bowed her head and whispered, "I know, but maybe I'm not here just to clean." That night, when the house went still, Clara walked quietly into the boys' room. The nightlight cast a pale glow over 3 small beds. Each boy turned away from the other, separated by invisible walls. She pulled a chair closer and spoke softly, her voice barely above a breath. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. Losing someone can make the world feel unsafe. But I'm not leaving." Luke rolled over, suspicious. Ethan scowled. "Everyone says that. Then they're gone." Clara's eyes softened. "Maybe, but I'm not planning to go anywhere. You can hate me, you can ignore me, but I'll still be here. Not just tonight." The room went quiet. Outside, the wind whispered against the glass, a sound almost like a lullaby. After a moment, Clara began to speak again, her tone gentle and rhythmic. "Once upon a time, there were 3 little wolves who lost their mother in a storm. They were scared and hungry, but they learned to protect one another, not because someone told them to, because they realized no one else would." Lucas lifted his head. "Did they ever find their mom again?" he asked. Clara smiled, eyes glimmering. "No, honey, but they found each other, and sometimes that's enough not to be lost anymore." By the time she finished, the boy's breathing had slowed. The tension melted, replaced by the soft rise and fall of sleep. Clara sat for a while longer, watching them, 3 little lives adrift, finally resting. She smiled, a tired but peaceful smile, and in that quiet, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Down the hall, David worked late under the glow of his desk lamp, unaware that, just a few walls away, a quiet stranger had begun stitching together the pieces of a home he thought could never be whole again. Since the night she told the story of the 3 little wolves, something in the house had shifted. Gently, almost imperceptibly, but real. The next morning, when Clara came down to the kitchen, she found 3 bowls already set on the table. No one said a word, no one admitted to it, but she knew it was their way of saying, "Don't leave." In the days that followed, Clara began to observe each child closely, as if they were delicate pieces of a puzzle, slowly finding their place. Ethan, 10 years old, the one who seemed the toughest, was actually the most fragile. He froze during thunderstorms, hiding inside the closet, pressing his hands over his ears. Clara never pried, never lectured. She would simply sit in the hallway and hum an old lullaby her mother used to sing, a southern melody soft as water. When the storm finally passed, Ethan would peek through the door crack. She'd smile. He'd say nothing, but after that night, every time thunder rolled, he only needed her song to stay calm. Luke was different. He didn't rebel, but he didn't connect either. Clara noticed he always carried a dull pencil, sketching absent-mindedly on milk cartons or the edges of his homework. "Do you like to draw?" she asked one afternoon. He shrugged. "I just don't know how to talk like other people." The next day, Clara stopped by a small stationery shop and bought him a sketchbook with her weekend tip money. She placed it on his desk with a note that read, "You don't have to speak. You can draw." That night, passing by his room, she saw the light still on and half the first page already filled with messy, beautiful lines. Then there was Lucas, the youngest, who collected stones. Every walk, he'd come home with his pockets full of pebbles, shiny ones, cracked ones, tiny ones. "Why do you keep them?" Clara asked. He thought for a moment. "Because they're small, but they don't disappear." The answer stopped her. The next day, she placed 3 glass jars on the windowsill, labeled "Things That Matter," one for each boy. Lucas put in a pebble first. Ethan added a broken Lego piece. Luke slipped in a torn drawing of 2 hands holding. No one explained, but somehow they all understood. They were learning to keep the things that truly mattered. The house began to change. Not because of money or noise, but because someone was finally paying attention. Clara started rising earlier, making breakfast, setting a small flower on the table each morning. She didn't impose rules, didn't fill silence with words. She just stayed. And somehow, that made everything softer. Before each meal, she closed her eyes for a short prayer. Thank you for keeping us together today. She never asked the boys to join, but Lucas began to close his eyes. Then Luke followed, and Ethan, though he stayed quiet, didn't walk away. One evening, as Clara washed dishes, Luke whispered, barely audible, "Thank you, God, for making it hurt less today." The words almost disappeared under the sound of running water, but Clara heard them. She turned, smiled, and said nothing. In the warm kitchen light, her eyes glistened as if she had just witnessed a miracle. From that night on, storms no longer brought shouting. There were small laughs, awkward jokes, dinners that weren't entirely silent. Ethan helped her flip pancakes, Luke taped his drawings to the wall, and Lucas proudly showed off each new rock. This one's shaped like a heart. The house that once only echoed began to breathe again. It had rhythm, warmth, and someone who truly saw it. Clara hadn't brought magic into the Collins home, only patience. And sometimes that's all it takes to turn silence into healing. Since Clara's arrival, the Collins house had begun to breathe differently. Mornings came with sunlight, nights with soft laughter and quiet prayers before dinner. The change was slow, almost invisible, like water seeping through dry soil. Even David, buried in work, couldn't help but feel it, the strange comfort of coming home to something warm. One rainy night, after a late flight, David returned home past midnight. The city glowed faintly outside the window, 1,000 lights blurred by rain. He set down his briefcase, loosened his tie, and started toward his office out of habit, until he heard a voice. It was soft, rhythmic, and warm, drifting down the hall from the children's room. He slowed his steps, drawn toward the light spilling through the cracked door. He stopped there, motionless, as Clara's voice reached him. "Thank you, God, for helping us not be afraid today. Thank you for staying." Then came Ethan's small voice. "Thank you for Clara, for not leaving." Luke whispered, "Thank you for making it hurt less." And finally, Lucas, "Thank you because maybe Mom is listening." David gripped the door frame, breath caught in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like a stranger in his own home, an outsider peering into something sacred. The man who had his name on skylines, who designed towers of glass and light, stood frozen, trembling before a scene built not by wealth, but love. He didn't enter. He quietly stepped back, closing the door with care, afraid even his presence might shatter the peace. His vision blurred. He couldn't tell if it was from exhaustion or tears. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bathtub, the faucet dripping slowly, the sound steady and sharp. Then, from somewhere deep inside memory, her voice returned. Laura's voice, soft and distant. "You build houses, David, but what they need is a home." He let out a hollow laugh that turned into a sigh. In 4 years, he had built structures worth millions, drawn hundreds of blueprints, but let the one place that mattered crumble beneath his silence. He looked into the mirror and saw not the man in magazines, but someone tired, lost, hollow-eyed. He pressed his palms to his face, whispering to no one, "I don't know how to fix this." And then a quiet realization. Maybe he wasn't supposed to fix it. Maybe he just needed to stay. As dawn crept through the blinds, he rose, walked to the kitchen, and switched on the light. The air smelled faintly of yesterday's coffee. He fumbled with the coffee maker, burnt a slice of toast, and laughed at himself when smoke curled toward the ceiling. When Clara entered, she froze for a moment. There he was, shirt wrinkled, hair disheveled, but his eyes clear. He looked at her and said softly, "I'll stay for breakfast." She blinked, then smiled. "The boys will be happy to hear that." Minutes later, Ethan, Luke, and Lucas ran in, stopping short at the sight of their father at the table. Lucas asked, "Are you sick?" David chuckled. "No, just home." He poured coffee, adjusted the crooked plate, and for the first time in years, the silence felt kind. And in that small kitchen, filled with burnt toast and early light, David Collins finally understood. Some beginnings don't start with thunder. They start with a simple promise: I'll stay. Since that morning when David said, "I'll stay for breakfast," the Collins home had begun to truly change. He spent mornings with his sons, tried pancakes with Clara, even smiled now and then, a smile he'd forgotten he had. But not everyone saw this as a good thing. Margaret, his mother, sharp and composed, started visiting more often. She sat like a judge in her favorite armchair, eyes sweeping over every corner of the house. The more she saw David laugh with his children, the more uneasy she became. One morning she set down her teacup and said coolly, "You're changing, David, and not in the right direction." He glanced up. "I'm just being home, Mother." Her lips tightened. "That woman, Clara, are you sure she's here to clean? She seems rather close." David's tone was calm. "She's here for the boys. No one's made them laugh like that in 4 years." Margaret's eyes hardened. "Feelings make you weak, David. This family needs structure, not sentiment." The next day, while David was away, Margaret called Clara and asked to meet. "Lunch, just us." "Tight." They met at a restaurant of marble and glass, the kind of place where silence carried weight. Clara sat straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Margaret studied her, then placed a thick envelope on the table. $500,000, she said. "A new start somewhere else?" Clara froze. Margaret continued, "I don't dislike you, Miss Thompson, but this family has lost enough. We can't afford more chaos." A pause. Then Clara lifted her head, voice quiet but steady. "I'm not here for him. I'm here for the boys." Margaret's tone softened only slightly. "You're mistaken. Sometimes leaving is the kindest thing you can do." Clara smiled sadly. "No, ma'am. Leaving only teaches them that everyone disappears when things get hard." She slid the envelope back and stood. "Thank you for lunch, but I can't take money to vanish. I've done that once before, and I almost lost myself." Margaret's face didn't move, but her silence spoke louder than words. That night, Clara packed her things. She didn't cry. She simply moved quietly through the dim apartment, her heart heavy. On each boy's pillow, she left a note. "I love you. I'm sorry. Don't stop growing." Then she closed the door behind her, her shadow swallowed by the hallway light. The next morning, David woke to an unfamiliar silence. He called, "Clara?" No answer. He searched every room, kitchen, balcony, laundry, all spotless, lifeless. Her mug still sat on the counter, a faint trace of coffee inside. Ethan found the note first. "She promised," he shouted, his voice breaking. Lucas clutched his own note in both hands, crying into it. Luke said nothing, just stared at the floor. David stood still, reading the same line over and over, unable to breathe past it. The house that had just begun to live again had gone still once more. Not the clean, empty quiet from before, but a silence that ached with loss. After the children's sobs faded into the stillness, David stood frozen in the living room, the note trembling in his hand. The words, "Don't stop growing," blurred beneath falling tears. The house had gone silent again, but this silence was different. It wasn't emptiness. It was grief. He marched to his mother's room, where Margaret sat before her vanity, adjusting her pearl necklace. His voice was low, raw. "What did you do?" She didn't flinch. "What I had to. You've let emotions cloud your judgment." David's hand tightened around the note. "Emotions?" he choked out. "You protected your pride, Mother, but I'm losing my family." Margaret blinked, startled. She had never seen her son's eyes burn like that. "She made those boys believe again," he continued, voice shaking. "She gave them something I couldn't, peace. And you took that from them." Margaret rose sharply. "You don't understand, David. That woman doesn't belong here." He met her gaze, steady and fierce. "No, Mother. She belongs to them. And if I have to choose, I'll choose my sons." The room filled with a tense, suffocating quiet. Margaret turned away without another word. David stood there for a moment, chest heaving, then walked out before the anger consumed him. That night, he didn't sleep. He called the housekeeping agency, demanded every record they had on Clara Thompson. After several tense minutes, the operator hesitated, then said, "Her file lists a hometown, Baton Rouge, Louisiana." That was all he needed. At dawn, he found his son slumped at the breakfast table, eyes red. He stood in the doorway, jacket on, phone in hand. "Pack a small bag," he said. "We've got a flight to catch." Ethan looked up. "Leaving where?" David met his gaze. "To find her." No one argued. Lucas grabbed his stuffed bear. Luke clutched the jar labeled, "Things That Matter." And Ethan silently put on his backpack. They stepped outside, leaving behind a house that had grown cold again, but not without purpose. They booked the first flight to Baton Rouge. By afternoon, a rented car carried them along 2 quiet hours of highway. Forests and forgotten towns drifting past their windows. At first, silence ruled the car, only the hum of the engine and the soft rush of wind. Then Lucas spoke. "She liked sitting on the balcony. She said the trees were growing just fine." Ethan added, "She made better pancakes than Dad." Luke turned to the window, murmuring, "She said even silence can heal, if someone stays." David gripped the steering wheel tighter. Their voices cut through him, one by one. He realized they weren't searching for a housekeeper. They were chasing the piece of their home that had gone missing. The soul of it. By the time they left the airport, the sun was sinking low, painting the horizon in gold. David's voice came soft, almost to himself. "We're not just looking for her. We're finding our way back." The boys said nothing, but their eyes met in the rearview mirror. And for the first time in years, there was light in them. And as the road stretched on, David Collins finally felt his heartbeat, not for achievement, not for survival, but for something that finally felt right. Love that stayed. The afternoon sun bathed the small Louisiana town in gold as David's car turned down a quiet street. Houses sat beneath moss-draped oaks, smoke curled from chimneys, and the air smelled faintly of rain and jasmine. It felt like time itself had slowed, waiting for something to be mended. He stopped by a tiny general store and asked the woman at the counter, "Do you know where Clara Thompson lives?" She smiled kindly. "She's at the church. She goes there every afternoon to pray." David looked at his sons. Their eyes widened, hearts rising in unison. No words were needed. They ran toward the small white church at the end of the street. The church was old but beautiful, wooden walls painted pale, stained glass windows glowing with sunset. The doors stood ajar. Inside, candlelight flickered, and the faint scent of wax and cedar hung in the air. A woman knelt at the front pew, hands folded, head bowed. Clara. The boys couldn't hold back. Their footsteps echoed through the hall. "Miss Clara!" Lucas shouted first, voice breaking. Then Luke joined, trembling. "Miss Clara!" Ethan's voice cracked as he called her name. Clara turned. The moment her eyes met theirs, tears spilled down her cheeks. She stood, breath catching, as the 3 boys rushed into her arms. She held them close, laughing and crying all at once. "You promised you'd stay," Lucas sobbed. Clara kissed his hair. "I know, sweetheart. I went the wrong way." David stepped forward slowly, sunlight streaming across his face. His voice trembled, steady, yet raw. "I don't know where this is supposed to go, Clara. I don't have a plan, but I know this. Without you, we're not a family." Clara looked up through her tears. In that moment, she saw not the cold executive she once met, but a man finally learning how to love again. She had taken the morning flight after finding the house empty and David's message on her phone. No arguments this time, only a destination. Then the heavy church doors opened. Margaret entered quietly. Her heels clicked against the stone floor, echoing softly. When she saw them, her son, her grandchildren, and the woman she had driven away, her posture faltered. She walked closer, her voice trembling. "I was wrong," she said simply. "I thought I was protecting my family, but all I did was break it." Silence filled the space. The air shimmered with light pouring through stained glass. Margaret reached into her coat and pulled out a photograph. It was slightly worn but well kept. 3 little boys crouched beside 3 small saplings on the balcony, sunlight in their hair. She handed it to Clara, whispering, "They've grown because of you." Clara looked at the photo for a long time, her fingers trembling. A small, tearful smile curved on her lips. She lifted her gaze, eyes gentle. "Then let's grow together," she said softly. David stepped closer, taking her hand. The boys pressed against them, smiling through their tears. Margaret watched, her sternness melting away. For the first time, she didn't feel like an observer. She felt like part of something alive. The golden light of dusk filled the church, wrapping them in warmth. Bells rang in the distance, echoing through the air. And in that sound, among tears and forgiveness, they found what they had all been missing. Not perfection, but presence. When they returned to Seattle, the house seemed to recognize them, changed, softer somehow. Morning light spilled through the tall windows, falling across the wooden floor, no longer cold. Clara opened the door and breathed in deeply. The scent of cinnamon and old pine lingered in the air like a welcome home. The boys rushed in, their laughter echoing through the rooms. "She's back!" Lucas shouted. Ethan ran to the jars on the windowsill, and Luke touched the little wooden sign above the table. Things that matter. Clara was no longer the maid. She wore no apron, no longer stood quietly at the edges. Now she sat with them at meals, told stories, and listened to the boys share new dreams. No one had to say it aloud. She was part of the family. David canceled 3 major projects. He stopped chasing meetings, stopped living by schedules and screens. Each morning he brewed his own coffee, burnt the toast, as always, but laughed this time. He learned to read bedtime stories, his voice awkward at first, then warmer with every page. By the time he finished, Lucas would be half asleep. Luke would lean on his shoulder, and Ethan would pretend to snore just to hear another chapter. At night, before turning off the lights, Clara prayed softly, and this time David joined her. Not perfectly, not solemnly, just simply. "Thank you for today, for the ones still here." He realized prayer wasn't about speaking to God, but about remembering what's worth keeping. Margaret changed more than anyone. She visited often, no longer with sharp eyes, but with pies and laughter. She sat on the couch listening to her grandsons talk about school, laughing when Lucas mispronounced a word, sometimes turning to Clara and asking, "Are you resting enough?" Her voice had softened, her pride gently worn down by love. The house that once sheltered only grief had become a home again, imperfect, noisy, real. And in that simple truth, David understood. What stays is not a person or a thing, but a feeling, the feeling of belonging, of peace, of home. Snow had been falling since early morning, quietly blanketing the balcony and the street far below. That Christmas, the Collins penthouse above the city glowed like a warm lantern in the coldest winter. Golden lights wrapped around the railings, glittering over the 3 trees that now reached almost to the roof. Inside, laughter echoed. Christmas music played softly from an old speaker, blending with the scent of cinnamon, baked cookies, and familiar coffee. Lucas ran circles around the Christmas tree, holding a roll of ribbon, singing off-key. "Dad, I think the angel should go on top of the tree." Ethan pretended to scold him. "No, last year you dropped it." Luke laughed quietly. "Then maybe let Dad try this time." In the kitchen, Clara stirred a pot of hot cocoa, steam curling around her face. Margaret sat near the fireplace, knitting a red scarf that was nearly finished. Occasionally, she looked up and smiled, her eyes gentler than they had been in years. David stood by the doorway, a cup of coffee in hand, silently taking it all in. The light, the laughter, the warmth, all the things he had once lost. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw Laura's face in memory, smiling softly in this very room before fading like breath on glass. And in that empty space, Clara stood now, real, alive, and carrying the warmth of the present. That evening, they gathered around the tall Christmas tree. The lights shimmered across their faces, painting the room in gold. Clara was placing the final star on top when David stepped closer. His voice was low, calm, but full of feeling. "I used to think all I had to do was build a house to keep everything from falling apart. But I was wrong. A house without love is just walls that know how to breathe." Clara turned, her eyes reflecting the glow of the lights. "David," she whispered, but he continued, his tone trembling slightly. "You came into our lives not to replace anyone, but just to stay, quietly, patiently. And you taught me how to do the same. I used to believe loss makes people harder, but you showed me that sometimes what makes us strong is gentleness." He reached into his pocket, took out a small velvet box, and opened it. The diamond sparkled in the firelight, reflecting everything they had lived through: pain, grace, and healing. He smiled faintly, his breath mingling with the soft music. "I can't promise this life will be free of storms," he said. "But I can promise this. No matter what comes, I won't run anymore. I'll stay. For you, for the boys, for everything we've lost and found again." Clara brought a trembling hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. "David, do you know you're making me cry?" "I hope it's because you're happy," he said softly, eyes steady on hers. "Because I want to spend the rest of my life making you smile." She laughed through her tears, nodding over and over. "Yeah, yes, 1,000 times yes." The boys shouted, "She said yes," and leapt into their arms. Laughter filled the room, mingling with the sound of Margaret's quiet sobs. She wiped her eyes with the corner of her scarf, whispering, "Laura must be smiling right now." Outside, snow fell thicker. They all stepped onto the balcony together. The 3 little trees had grown tall, their leaves silvered with frost. The wooden sign below still bore Luke's crooked handwriting, now joined by Lucas's messy red letters. "Things that stay." Clara leaned her head against David's shoulder, her voice barely more than a breath. "See, David? The things that stay aren't what we hold tight. They're what we choose to walk through together." He squeezed her hand, murmuring, "And I choose to stay. Always." Church bells rang faintly in the distance, their echoes drifting through the snow. In the warm light, amid the laughter of their children, David closed his eyes and smiled. He knew this was the home he had once tried to build with steel and stone, but in the end it had been built with love.